I was gently bumbling along at about 42 or 43,000 feet, minding my own business really, because it was just getting some hours in for Saka. So not much in the way of why was I there. And so my mind was slightly in neutral, I would imagine, and suddenly the aircraft almost shook itself to bits as this engine wound down. A lot of noise and adrenaline flowing then.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. For many, the dream of flying begins in childhood, staring up at the sky and wondering what it would be like to soar amongst the clouds. Jeremy Lane's fascination for aviation was nurtured by countless hours spent watching aircraft at Staverton Airport and North Weald. Jeremy describes his experiences flying the Jet Provost and later the Canberra. He describes the capabilities of this versatile and iconic aircraft, from high-speed reconnaissance to its nuclear role. The Canberra's design, with its twin jet engines and rudimentary navigation equipment, required a high level of skill and constant attention. The stories of flying at low levels, navigating with minimal aids and the ever-present risk of engine failure provide a gripping insight into the life of an RAF pilot in the late 1960s. Whether you're an aviation enthusiast or simply curious about the life of an RAF pilot during the Cold War, this episode offers a compelling and immersive experience. Tune in next week for part 2, where we go into detail about the challenges of nuclear operations along the edge of the Iron Curtain. I'm delighted to welcome Jeremy Lane to our Cold War conversation.
My parents and their generation were all involved in the Second World War. So to that extent, they were military, but not in the professional sense, i.e. long-term military careers. So my father actually invalided out of the military during the war. And my mother served as an ambulance driver and a staff car driver, I think. And my father joined the BBC and became a producer of children's hour on the radio. And as a result of that, quite unusual in those days, he did a lot of foreign travelling. And one of the things that he did was he flew with British Airways, and the captain who he interviewed as part of, he was doing a series of, it was about jobs. And so one of those was interviewing a British Airways captain whose name I still have on my tongue, Laurie Arthur. He came and stayed with us, and more than a few times, drank more than a few bottles of whiskey, and to my father's chagrin, I think. But he introduced me to the thought of flying, I suppose. I think I was already interested at that point. In fact, I know I was, because I had spent many hours when I was at school in Cheltenham down at Staverton Airport. And before that, I remember when I was living in Thaden Boys, which is near Epping, going on the train out to North Weald, which was then an operational station, and just standing on the perimeter and just watching the aircraft and thinking, I wonder what it would be like to be up there.
So you joined the RAF out of a fascination for flying and for aircraft?
Yeah, I mean, I did. When I was at school, we had ATC, Combined Cadet Force, as it was known at my school, but I mean, it was essentially military training at a basic level. And I was in charge of the RAF section, sergeant in charge, I think. I can't remember, something like that. But I had the opportunity to go flying on Chipmunks. I was taken to Filton, Bristol, and I would sit in a crew room waiting for anybody to give me an opportunity to go up for half an hour in a Chipmunk. And I don't know how many hours I did flying. I did a lot more sitting in a crew room than I did flying, but I certainly got some experience of flying. And then I did my flying scholarship, which I was doing while I was still at school. So I got my private pilot's license courtesy of the Royal Air Force. And I did, I think in those days it was 30 hours. And I did it at Birmingham Airport.
What year did you actually join the RAF?
I joined the Air Force in 1966, January 1966. I left school in 1964. I did a year at a language school in Geneva and then came back and joined the Air Force. So it was a bit of a sort of straightforward move from school to Air Force because they provided you with everything. Food. The only thing you had to do was buy your own beer. But there wasn't much time for drinking beer, to be honest. They had you working out as it was a boot camp, and there was some education at the same time. I was at South Cerney, which was an old wartime airbase. And I remember on day one, and it was an absolute shock to the system. I guess I was 19. Yeah, 19. We were invited to run around the perimeter track carrying a dining room bench, if you can imagine what a dining room bench was like. And the two of you, one at the front, one at the back. And I don't know how long the perimeter was, but it must have been at least a couple of miles to get around the Perry track on that airfield. And if you got back and were still standing up, they just invited you to go around again. So there were many of us who thought we were quite fit, but we found out that we were not at all fit. And we were all, the following day down in South Cerney village, we were all like a bunch of old cripples walking through the town. But that was the introduction, and it went on like that from there on. One of my lasting memories is doing the assault course. And part of the assault course was to walk along the edge of a hangar on the roof. I mean, there was no health and safety in those days, no ropes, no high-vis vests, or I don't know what else they wear these days, but there was nothing in those days. And part of the assault course was to go over, climb up to the top of the roof on the hangar, the old World War II hangars that they had, and walk along the edge of that and get down the other end. Well, I had, believe it or not, although they never discovered this because I never told anybody, I had a terrible head for heights. And walking, as a pilot, it doesn't affect you when you're flying, but it does when you're looking down over a precipice. And I surprised myself, amazingly, got down the other side and never had to do it again, I don't think. And they taught you to be a military man. We had a week in Wales on a camp, and then they taught you all the etiquette of being an officer. And at the end of it, you were commissioned with a uniform and acting pilot officer with a view to going off to flying training. And I think it was about 6 months, I think, something like that. Maybe not long, maybe it was only 3.
It probably felt like 6 months.
It certainly did. I spent a lot of time sleeping because it was really grueling work, a lot of work in the gym, carrying medicine balls, and obviously a lot of parade work, learning military discipline and learning military rules and understanding Queen's regulations and all that stuff. It was. Look back on it with great affection. I think it was brilliant. But and the other thing that I remember so well was my first pay parade. I thought, because I was being looked after, I didn't expect to be paid. I didn't think anybody's going to pay me, and the naivety of it all was just extraordinary. And I think my first pay parade, I got a brown paper envelope with, I think it was 5 shillings. Is my recollection. In the first, or maybe it was. No, it was definitely in the sort of 5 to 10 shilling area, for a week of hard labour. So anyway, that all came to an end, and because I got my flying scholarship, I didn't have to do the primary training, which was on chipmunks, which a lot of them had to do, but I'd done my flying scholarship, so they sent me straight to Staverton, which was near Cambridge, and still there, I think. Staverton is I don't know. Anyway, it was one of a number of primary basic flying training schools where you spent a year on Jet Provost.
Right. Your first introduction to flying jet.
That was my first introduction to flying jets, and I think we were one of the first, because the Jet Provost hadn't been introduced that many years before. So we were one of the very early all-jet trained pilots. They were, before that, they were piston provosts and then Harvards and things, which were, training pilots in the Second World War, Canadian active. So we didn't get to see those.
And was the Provost is a training aircraft? It was intended to be easy to fly How did you enjoy flying the Provost?
Absolutely loved it. I mean, when you get a toy like that, and you're flying it at somebody else's expense. I mean, it's big boys' toys. I mean, it's just fantastic, and I loved every minute of it. And I was clearly meant to fly. I didn't have any problems. I never had check rides or re-rides or attempts to have me thrown off the course. The failure rate was significantly high. We called it the chop rate. If you were invited to go with a chop ride, on a chop ride with the chief flying instructor, you knew your time was up. And that guys it was quite intimidating, really, as a process. But you didn't get on because they didn't want to be paying for you when they knew you were clearly not cut out for it.
So in your class, let's say, how many people didn't make it through? What sort of percentage was that failure rate?
I can't give you a figure, but I mean, I guess we were about 20 of us on the course. I would say by the time you got to the end of your training, there weren't that many of us left. I mean, in terms of fast jet trained pilots, so we moved on from there to Valley to fly Nats, and I would think by the time we'd finished on Nats, the chop rate must have been I would think it was about 50%.
Wow.
Half people never made it. No.
And so, what would have happened to those people? Would they have been put onto propeller aircraft?
Yeah, some would have.
Something like that?
Yeah, some would have gone. Some would have gone to helicopters. Some would have gone to transport. They wouldn't all have been complete failures. But if you didn't get through basic flying training, then you didn't go anywhere. I mean, you just got chopped and that was it.
Yeah.
But if you got through basic flying training, you got your wings.
I just want to ask the question. So what is the difference that they're looking for with fast jet versus other flying? Is it reaction or time? What are they looking for there?
I think it's aptitude for. I mean, I'm not able to answer your question because I never became a flying instructor, so I can say I don't really know what they were looking for particularly, but I would guess it was aptitude for fast jet operations. I mean, in those days there were really only three operational types in the fast jet world. There was the Lightning, the Hunter, and the Canberra. Those were the three fast jets of the day, operationally. When I got to the end of my advanced flying training at Valley, I did have to restate a bit of one part of the process, which was the navigation. And I never really think that I kept up with the aeroplane, or I did get through. I mean, I was past, but it was flying at, when you're flying a Jet Provost, I think we flew at 220 knots or thereabouts at low level, 250 feet. And you're moved on to something which lands at about 160, 150, 130 knots. I think it landed at 130, 140 knots. But I mean, the Nat was a fabulous aeroplane. I loved flying it. But moving from large-scale maps to half-mil maps, which have very little detail on it, and we didn't have any other navigation aids really, not at low level. It was Mark 1 eyeball. That was it. And things happen very quickly at 420 knots. I mean, they really do. That happens very quickly. And you're at 250 feet, 420 knots, and everything's going past very quickly. And I never seemed to catch up with the aeroplane. So a lot of my flying at low-level navigation was pretty much guesswork. and I hoped I'd end up at the right place at the right time. Anyway, so yeah, I think that was we were shown the opportunities for postings. Could put down our preferences at the end of advanced flying training, and so I decided I needed a navigator. So the choices to have a navigator were not the Hunter and they weren't the Lightning. They were both single seat. So I had the choice of a Canberra or the V-Force. And the V-Force was considered to be a death knell by those going through because you weren't in charge of the airplane. You had to sit beside somebody who was going to be, basically you were a crewman, and I didn't want that either. So I opted for Canberras. And we were shown a promotional film at Valley about the Canberra, and I thought it looked very exciting. So I was delighted when I got my posting from Valley to go to the Canberra OCU, which was at Bassingbourn.
Can you just describe what that aircraft is like?
Yeah, well, it was designed by a chap called Heather, who worked for the English Electric Company after the war. And there was an air staff requirement for an aircraft to effectively replace the Mosquito, which had been the high-speed reconnaissance and fighter air-to-air. I mean, they had guns and all sorts, but no self-defense. This was a high-speed bomber for the new age, if you like. The Canberra was a twin-jet engine, quite basic in many respects. I mean, it didn't have any powered flying controls. It had very rudimentary navigation equipment. From the Second World War, because really hadn't moved on much from that. In fact, many of the more sophisticated things that they developed during the Second World War were never fitted to the aircraft, never fitted to Canberras. It was a low, medium, high level aircraft. It was very versatile, had obviously a bombing capability, a good range. You could fly high level for 4.5 hours. I mean, you could fly from the UK down to Cyprus in one hop. It was pressurized, but only partly pressurized. So you didn't have like you have in a modern cabin of an airliner, where you can sit there to roughly 8,000 feet, is what most airliners are flying at inside in the cabin. Whereas the Canberra was half your height plus 2, so the operational height of a Canberra, anything up to 48,000 feet, so you would be at 24 plus 2, so 26,000 feet inside the aircraft, so it was bloody cold. It was cold. It wasn't particularly noisy, but you had to fly it all the time. So whether you were low level or high level, it was 100% flying. No autopilot. The only version which came with an autopilot, I believe, I never flew it, but the PR9, I think did have an autopilot and also had power flying control, so a much easier aeroplane to fly in the end. The final version, the final iteration of the Canberra was a very fine aeroplane, and people who flew it loved it. And we loved the versions. The operational version that I flew was the BI-8, that it was, I think, introduced in about 1956, the BI-8. So by the time I got to fly it, it was probably 12 years old by the time I got to fly it. But they were still considered to be quite potent aeroplanes. You could carry a bomb load in the bomb bay, and there were pylons on the wings, also for carrying bombs or rockets in Germany. Our main role, by the time I'd finished my training or conversion on the Canberras, I went out to Germany, and our main role was support of SACA, the Supreme Allied Command Europe, who had a plan to wipe out the Russians in Eastern Europe. So we were nuclear armed, which most people don't know.
I did do a little bit of research about the Canberra, and I was really surprised to find that NASA still fly to massively modified, but it's still essentially a Canberra.
It is, yeah, they do. They use them for network, I think, and also the photography of launches and recovery of space capsules. Yeah, they've been doing that for years. Yeah, that's as you say, it's a very heavily modified version of the Canberra, but it was still basically. I mean, the Canberra was so advanced at the time when it came out. I mean, it won, for example, very early on. It won the fastest time from the UK to Australia, and it was in a PR3, I think. In fact, I'm sure it was because I flew it. That particular aircraft I flew when I was converting onto Canberras at Bassingbourn. It did the first transatlantic jet flight. It was the only, I think, even to this very day, the only aircraft, or maybe the Harrier came later, but the at that time, certainly until the Harrier, was the only aircraft that the Americans bought from anybody else. Bought the design and built it under license. And they built a much better version than ours, of course, you could imagine. But the B-57, it became the B-57. And it flew, and did a lot of work in the Vietnam War. I mean, it was a very important aircraft for the Americans.
Yeah, it's a tribute to the aircraft that, it was one of two really types that the US bought from us. What was it like to fly? I guess it's not as lively as a gnat, but
no, absolutely not. But I mean, it performed. I mean, most of the time we flew with wing tanks for reasons of endurance, really, which could be jettisoned in the event that you needed to get rid of them. I.e., but the performance limits of the Canberra, on a daily basis, were affected by the fact that we were carrying wing tanks. So the maximum speed. Maximum airspeed was 360 knots carrying wing tanks, 450 at ground level, 450 knots without wing tanks. Right. So it's quite, in its day, it was a remarkable aeroplane, but it had the limitations of a very weird system for operating the controls, which were through tubes. I mean, manually. I mean, you actually, when you pull something, or turned it. And in order not to overstress the aircraft, so you can imagine at 450 knots, it is, Canberra's big aeroplane. It would be quite easy to overstress it. And so it had a system with torque tubes. So when you turned, or let's say you moved a control, you moved a tube, which was then connected to another tube, and the outer tube would move, but only as much as the air pressure on the control surface would allow you to. So if it was going quite slowly, you could get full movement of the control surface. But if it was at 450 knots, you pretty much had to get your knee underneath the control column to make it move 2 or 3 degrees. I mean, it was a cleverly designed system, and it was designed to prevent overstressing the airplane. And the fact that these airplanes continued to fly well into the 1980s is testament to the fact that the system was actually quite remarkably effective. And so we had, the original aircraft were the PR3 and the B2. All crew members had ejection seats. And there were two guys who were trained as navigators sitting in the back seats, and they could crawl forward into the nose. There was a bomb aiming position at the front of the aircraft. In the original versions, they all had this very beautifully designed cockpit cover, if you like. It looked seamless, and it didn't give you quite the visibility the later models did, like the BI-8 and the PR-9, where you got all-round fighter cockpit visibility, 360 degrees almost, so you could turn your head around that far. But it was you got a lot of good visibility. There was lots of other things that we didn't like, mostly to do with the heating. There was practically no air conditioning and heating in these early aircraft. They were very poorly. So, flying at 35,000 feet got bloody cold after 2 or 3 hours. But not probably as bad as being in some of the wartime aircraft. I'm sure it wasn't, because we did have some air conditioning and heating, but it was still pretty damn cold.
And with you mentioned there the ejector seats. Was it the early versions that didn't have ejector seats for all crew?
No, they all did. The only aircraft that didn't was the BI-8, which was the operational model in Germany. All the other aircraft had ejection seats for all the crew members, but once you got to the BI-8, there were only two crew stations. There was the navigator and the pilot. The pilot sat up a sort of fighter type canopy, and the navigator sat in the forward section of the fuselage at a desk, really, and there was no ejection seat for him.
So he has to exit out.
He had to exit out. Yeah, he had to open the door, which was probably behind him, it would have been behind him probably, and he would escape with a parachute which he popped onto his chest. Would have been sitting by the door, and it had technically a 200-foot capability. So at 200 feet, you get out. I mean, one of the features of the Canberra and many of the Meteor and many of the twin-engined aircraft with engines outboard from the wing root, unlike, say, like the Comet, where the engines were right in at the wing root, but on the Canberra, the engines were quite far out down the wing. And so lateral control in the event of an engine failure was poor. at low speeds, and there was a dead man's space between liftoff, which was at about 130 knots in the Canberra. So the wheels came unstuck at about 130 knots, but the aircraft wasn't controllable on one engine until you were up to about 150 or 160 knots. And so there was that space in between where the pilot would undoubtedly have said, "Hey, I'm off," and would have pulled the handle, but, clearly would have done his best to get his crewman out. And we did practice a lot. In fact, they say that we lost far more people on practice single engine work in the circuit than anybody ever suffered from a genuine engine failure. There was only one person I know, and he now, God bless him, is no longer with us, but a guy called Stu Stringer, who got out of a Canberra after bird strike when he got airborne, and he was a navigator, and he got out and lived to tell the tale. So it worked.
Wow.
For him, but I don't know of anybody else who ever did. But certainly plenty of guys pregnant as a result of practice single engine work, which we did a lot of. We did a lot of it. I had one genuine single engine incident at high level in Germany where my port engine, I was gently bumbling along at about 42 or 43,000 feet, minding my own business really, because it was just getting some hours in for SACA. So not much in the way of why was I there. And so my mind was slightly in neutral, I would imagine, and suddenly the aircraft almost shook itself to bits as this engine wound down. A lot of noise and adrenaline flowing then, and that was my only experience of a complete engine failure. The engine actually seized, and so it was almost worse than practice because we never actually shut the engines down. In practice, the engines were always windmilling, if you like. But once you've got a seized engine, obviously the drag is significantly greater, and the single engine performance in a Canberra was. Safety speeds, which we have, as I'm sure all aircraft have their operational safety speeds for single or loss of engine performance. And the safety speed on a Canberra was 150, 155 knots, I think, from recollection. And in the event of a complete engine failure in the Canberra, you were advised. Well, in fact, no. I mean, it wasn't advice. It was the minimums that you could go to before you committed to land the aircraft, and 500 feet was the break-off height. So if you got below 500 feet, don't go round. You are now committed to land the aircraft, and the speed that you've got down to, obviously for landing, was below 150 knots. So we landed the aircraft around 130, 120 knots, 130 knots. And in this particular incident I had to land back at Gütersloh because it was an emergency, clearly, and I couldn't maintain height at 42,000 feet. I had to come down through controlled airspace, and eventually I was diverted to Gütersloh, which was the Lightning base. And Lightning pilots were very, 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 they considered themselves to be very special people, which I think probably they genuinely were. So these aircraft, they had an endurance of around about 30 minutes. You get airborne in a Lightning, and you're up and down, and 30 minutes you're back. And they had the fuel states of bingo 1 and bingo 2. And if they shouted bingo 1, that was then down to about, I don't know, 4 minutes of airborne time, something like that. They get down to bingo 2, it was 2 minutes of airborne time. I now need to land. And on this particular approach that I was doing to Gütersloh, I got down to my break-off height, and the ground controller said, "You need to go round again." I'm looking at my airspeed indicator and the altimeter, and I'm thinking, oh dear. Anyway, Lightning had priority over me, so I did go round, and we survived to tell the tale. But I did go and have a chat with the air traffic controller afterwards when I got down, and explained to him the particular features of the Canberra, which I shouldn't have done. I should not have done what I did. I should have just, committed to land. But anyway, we survived to tell the tale. There we are. There's lots of guys very sadly did not survive single engine practice. Never mind genuine single engine. Single engine practice was a real killer.
Yeah, I think I can't remember who I was interviewing. It could have been Vulcan pilot, and they said they sort of almost discontinued that single engine practice because it was just, the casualty rate was unacceptable.
Because I mean, nowadays people you just wouldn't go through this now because everybody's got simulators, which you can do all this on a simulator. You don't actually need to take an aeroplane up to do any of this now. But in those days, there was no option. You had to fly the aeroplane, and in the event that you had an engine failure, which I think was not that uncommon. It wasn't that uncommon. I mean, I think failures of one type or another. Hydraulic failures, for example. I had a total hydraulic failure, and that was not. You had to get the undercarriage down manually and so on. It wasn't. We were trained, but you had to be trained. You had to be trained because the aircraft in most cases was recoverable. You could get the aircraft back down.
Was the single engine failure the hairiest incident that you had in the RAF?
Oh, well, probably most people wouldn't even consider it hairy. I'm sure, a double engine failure would be much hairier.
It was challenging.
Yeah, I mean, challenging from the point of view of, well, I would look back on it and say, well, I'd just been trained to do what I needed to do. So was it hairy? I don't think it was really hairy. I mean, I remember a couple of sorties when I was in Germany. There were two really which come straight back to mind. One was we used to do a lot of pretending to be Russian aeroplanes flying into the UK. So we would set out from the Dutch coast and we would test the defences of the United Kingdom and do that. A lot of it was done at night. And I remember one particular night, we had radio altimeters in the Canberra, but they didn't tell you your height. They just were calibrated to 250 feet. So there was a green light, a red light, and an amber light is my recollection. And so the amber light was at the top, the green light was in the middle, and the red light was at the bottom. So if you went below 250 feet, the red light came on. And we flew one particular night. The weather was absolutely appalling. We didn't have to worry about one of the things you'd have to worry about now is lots of pylons and rigs out in the North Sea, which we didn't have in those days. So the only thing you could hit was a ship, and if you hit a ship, you were definitely below 200 feet. But nonetheless, this particular night, there was no horizon. You couldn't see anything. So visually, and you had to fly the aircraft visually because although you had instruments, you were still reliant on, looking out of the cockpit and having some visual reference. But it was black, absolutely black that night. And we were down at 200 feet, very, very close to the sea. And I do remember that being a very sweaty sortie. We wore immersion suits in those days. Immersion suits were designed to protect you if you had to get out of the aeroplane and fell into the water. The North Sea, it would keep you going for maybe half an hour. But there were very uncomfortable things, and if you sweated inside them or did anything else inside them, it was very soggy. And so I remember that sortie. So that was hairy, you could say. That was a pretty hairy flight. And I did one other one with a very nervous pilot on the squadron who came back with me from Cyprus one time. And we got to northern Germany, let down. And there was thick cloud, icing conditions, which were not very good in the Canberra. We had anti-icing on the ends, no de-icing on the wings. So, if the wings started to ice up, you needed to get out of the icing conditions. It wasn't a question of, fire off some boots or whatever they have on a modern aircraft. It was important to get away from it. But anyway, we had instrument flying conditions from 38,000 feet down to 200 feet. And we had a rumble seat what was called a rumble seat. So you could take a third crew member, and he had to sit beside you. So down below me on my right hand side was another pilot. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't even see what was happening because it's all he was inside the well of the aeroplane, if you like. But I remember him being very, very anxious about my ability to get this aeroplane down on the ground after, flying through all that clag. And it was because we didn't have we had very, very limited instrument. I mean, we had, instruments for night flying or for instrument flying were pretty basic. And we had an ILS, but it was rudimentary ILS, and often the ILSs weren't calibrated on the ground. So we didn't do ILS work very often, and so generally speaking, we flew with an air traffic controller who was giving you position information and where you were and where he thought you should go and heading and so on to get to the approach. So ground control approach is what we call them, TCA. So, and they were very skilled at it, these guys. They were very skilled at getting you on the ground. And I'm sure that particular day, I'm sure I did a GCA into Wildenrath, Albrook. I can't remember which it was now. And but again, it was a sweaty do. It was a sweaty do. It was turbulent. Yeah. There were thunderstorms about, icing. It was night, and just conditions that were designed to make you work very hard.
A lot of factors to deal with.
Yeah, and at the end of a 4.5 hour, pretty much 4.5 hour flight. So
with no autopilot.
With no autopilot, you were already tired. You were already feeling, So a descent through cloud from 35,000 feet or whatever it was. I mean, cumulonimbus were up at that sort of height, and back on the ground. So that was exciting. That was probably as exciting as it gets.
I want to talk about your posting to the nuclear role. Yeah. So when were you posted to the nuclear role, and did they vet you in any way for this role?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the Canberra training, including look at a nuclear bomb and having an explanation as to how it worked. I guess this was 1968. Yeah, I did my conversion in 68. This was top secret stuff, and we got as much information as we needed. It was, as the old adage, need to know. If you didn't need to know, you didn't get told. So it was a need to know basis. I didn't just the basic function of how a nuclear weapon worked, and so that was part of the training while we were still at Bassingbourn. And by the time I got out to Germany, the weapon that had been in use in both Cyprus and in Germany was a British weapon, and it was delivered by what was called a Labs maneuver, which, if you can imagine, the bomb got tossed off the airplane, so you would fly along at 250 feet, and there was an instrument in the. I never did this procedure, but there was an instrument in the cockpit, being removed by the time I got to fly the Canberra in Germany, but there was an instrument in the cockpit which would indicate to you the point at which you needed to pull up, and it would give you a pull up indication on the dial, and you would pull up and release the bomb at a point in the trajectory where it would fly off and hit the target some 2 or 3 miles away. In fact, the Vulcan that flew down to Falklands, they did the same process. So a Labs maneuver, lob, toss, whatever you like to call it, and toss the bombs onto the runway and into the Falklands. And that was the maneuver that was used for the bomb. And I say it was a British weapon, relatively low yield. I mean, obviously would have done a lot of damage, but it was designed to take out an airfield, but not take out the city next to it or whatever. Would have been pretty devastating. But anyway, by the time I got out to Germany, the aircraft had been converted to carry an American weapon, which was somewhat more versatile in that you could dial in the yield. So it could be programmed to produce a different yield depending on SACO's requirements, and it could be dropped at low level. You didn't have to climb up.
I'm sorry, that's where we're going to have to end it for this week, but make sure that you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss out on the next episode where Jeremy describes his experiences flying the nuclear-armed Canberra. Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening and see you next week.